only have 2 slides, so hopefully it shouldn't be too hard to switch. So yes, you've already heard a bit about the intern health study from Amy and Jenka. So over more than the past decade, we've collected data using a variety of mobile technologies. We started back in the early days cobbling together different platforms before there was even an option for a unified mobile app for data collection. Then we moved into developing our sort of first version of a custom app with an in-house U of M team. Then we moved into the private sphere with a commercial company, also working on a custom app, and then the past few years working with a commercial off-the-shelf platform. So as you can see, over the life of your study, you're probably going to work with a lot of different technologies. Sometimes that might be because you initiate the change. Other times for things out of your control, things like a product getting discontinued or companies going out of business. I can tell you a few of these are no longer around anymore, and I think Adam is probably going to speak more to that with company volatility in a few minutes. Also, things behind the scenes that we really don't have a lot of visibility on, like operating system updates that always seem to cause bugs, or spam filter algorithms that keep changing and making it harder for us to reach participants. So one thing that we found that's helped to insulate us a bit over the years against some of these unpredictable changes is to develop a robust testing strategy. So in the few minutes that I have, I just wanted to talk about some concrete best practices that we've developed over the years that hopefully can be helpful for you and your teams. So I'm a really, really big advocate of intensive study team user testing. So this is really getting your whole study team engaged. When we first started our study, we had our partners, our families, our extended networks, colleagues, everyone we could getting involved with testing. And a big, it's easy, I think, to maybe try to defer to the technical experts on this or the company that you're working with to take the lead on testing or do the majority of the testing. But definitely learned that you know your study the best, you know your participants the best. And so it's really, really important to dive in. And I think we dove in more heavily than we expected on that. But fortunately, our team really enjoys this process. And I think that's part of why we've been able to be so successful. But a big part of this is trying to replicate as many different user conditions as possible. So lots more testers help with that. Our study does use 3 different wearables and is available on Android and iOS devices. So there's a lot of possibilities for combinations that participants could have. So it's important to try to test as many variations as possible. When we first enabled Android functionality for our app, no one in our team or even our network had an Android phone. And so we actually had to go and buy some cheap Android phones just so we could do some testing. So things like that are important. Another thing that's really important, more so our study is a longitudinal study and it goes throughout the year, staying enrolled for the life of the study as a tester. Often study teams will test at the beginning, make sure that onboarding works properly, but it's really, really important to actually stay engaged as a tester on a daily basis or weekly basis, whatever participation requires in your study. And the main reason here is so that you can be the first one to know if something goes wrong. This is especially important, I think, if you have your own custom app, because again, those operating system updates are really killer, and the bugs, the crashes, that way you can really be proactive and on top of it. A testing hack that we actually only discovered in the last couple of years, and I don't know how many people are familiar with this, but one challenge that we have is in the testing process is needing to onboard as a new participant many times so we can test all the changes that we're making. And you can actually use this structure with your username or unique name with any Gmail account, including your UMISH account, where you just add a plus and a number. So it can be +1, +12 million. You can create as many as you want. And this will just go to your regular email inbox. But this way you can re-onboard as a new user and participant as many times as you want. And this has been a really helpful tool for us. And I can tell you our study coordinator will do this 30 to 50 times preparing for each new enrollment cycle. So it's really useful. Spam testing is also something that was a real game changer for us and we started doing a few years ago. So we are a completely remote study. We do all of our invitations via email. And we have this challenge where we have to write emails that make it through the spam filters, but then are also compelling and engaging and actually get people to enroll. Unfortunately, those two things are often at odds. So the spam tester will tell you that writing congratulations or putting an exclamation point in a subject line, or all those pretty graphics that you want to include, or the links to the information about your study and past publications, anything that might actually help encourage participants to enroll, those things are also going to make it more likely to get stuck in a spam filter. So using spam testing, and I give a couple example sites that you can use, has been really helpful for us in trying to find that sort of compromise zone with sending these emails. It also can be helpful for identifying technical issues that you might not even be aware of with your communications. So we use an external app company for our mobile app. However, we don't like to use their email extension when we send our messaging. We like to use our UMISH extension so we can look more legit. Our participants are all physicians, so they care a lot about seeing that sort of research rigor. But what we realized when we were doing the spam testing is even though our messages were saying they were sent from our UMISH extension, we were lacking a domain authentication key for the email because it was coming from an external source and that it was getting caught up in the spam filters. So as a result, things weren't getting through that we thought were getting through and sort of defeated the purpose. So we've actually spent the past 2 years working with HITS to allow that authentication to be granted to the private company. So we now can do this, and you can too if this is something that you're interested in as an option. But again, just a way that this kind of testing can help give you more insight into how your communications are getting through. Finally, analytics can be a great tool. So this is just looking at your email open rates or the click rates on your surveys, your enrollment links or other links that you include in your surveys, and can tell you who you're reaching, and probably more importantly, who you're not reaching. I can tell you from the testing that we've done, the Gmail emails are the best to reach out to because the spam filters are the worst. So we have a high success rate emailing with the Gmails. However, particularly our population, they're all incoming physicians. So many of them have health system emails, which, as we know, have lots of security and are a lot harder to get through to. And so it can help give you visibility if you're seeing differences in your enrollment rates with different groups by assessing in this way. And then just more generally, you can use the analytics to test your communications. If some are more effective than others, you can play around with wording, things like that. And we've often done this sort of small batch testing in early rounds of our recruitment to see if it's worth making certain changes with our communications. All right, I'm probably already over time, so I will stop it there and hand it over to Pedja.
Can't get rid of me quite yet. So what I want to spend next few minutes talking to you about is how to think broadly about what kind of infrastructure you want to use for your mobile health interventions. And just want to start with this little quote from Bill Buxton, who is a preeminent researcher in human-computer interaction. He says that all design is a compromise. Basically, whatever you're designing, it's always a matter of balancing trade-offs. And you can think about your infrastructure the same way, that any infrastructure system that you choose on is going to have trade-offs, and you basically need to figure out what trade-offs you're able to live with, right? And so the kinds of things that are on the table here is you can use off-the-shelf commercial software, right? If there's a set of questions that you can use just using things like Fitbits and Omron blood pressure cuffs and so on, and you can couple them together. All kinds of advantages come with that, and I'll talk about that in just a second. You can hire an outside firm to develop something completely custom for you. You can use systems like Fitabase or Care Evolution to do a white label solution, right? Where you sort of use the software stack that already exists and you customize it for your needs. You can do hybrid types of solutions where you have a set of commercial systems that are doing a part of what you need to do, and then you layer some custom code on top of that. So that walk-to-joy intervention that I was talking about earlier this morning was basically using a standard Fitbit app for doing most of the self-monitoring in the Fitbit system, and then sending people custom text messages that we code and that were being sent from a custom server that we developed. And then, of course, you can have a completely custom system that you would develop from scratch, right? And so one way to think about this is that all of those various options vary on a set of dimensions. So one of the dimensions is cost, right? So just getting some Fitbits and blood pressure cuffs is probably the cheapest option if you go completely commercial. to having a company build you a custom code that's going to be high on the cost side, right? Another dimension is flexibility, right? So building your own app typically gives you the most flexibility to exactly create the kind of experience you want your users to have, and if that is where your science is, that might make sense, right? The more you move towards some of these white label solutions or custom systems, the more flexibility you lose, right? So that's one thing. Another dimension that we often forget about is who you get to yell at if things break, right? And this is actually pretty important, right? If you're working with Google and Fitbit, there's very rarely a person that you can reach directly who can make a change, right? Very quickly. You might be able to find out what happened, but they're not, those kinds of large companies are not going to be particularly responsive. If you're working with a smaller firm like Fitbit or Care Evolution for one of these white label solutions, there is usually a person that you can reach on the phone who can talk directly to the programmers to fix things. If you have a computer science undergrad who is building your code and they're studying for an exam, they're just going to ignore your calls and your emails, and things are going to wait until they re-engage. And so that ends up being something that you have to really think carefully about depending on what kind of study you're running, right? And so there's a number of these kinds of dimensions that I think make sense. You really need to be thinking about when you're making these decisions. But really, ultimately, I think the way to make these kinds of decisions really have to do with being very, very clear about what this particular system for this particular study is supposed to accomplish, right? And the key question there that all of us know, but we often forget to make explicit, is really, where is your science? So if you're trying to study, let's say, some features of messaging, like framing, like is this messaging, loss-based or promotion-based, it could very well be that exactly how those messages are delivered is less important, that you can do a text message and that might work just as well as having an app that has push notifications, right? On the other hand, if really where most of your science is sitting at the level of specific algorithms, you need to be able to run a system that can incorporate those algorithms. Same kind of thing for the kind of work that I do, where some of the design decisions that are being incorporated are actually the things that we're studying. And if you need to have fine level control over visual design, certain kinds of things are going to be certain infrastructural solutions like custom code or some of these hybrid systems might be better ways to go than relying completely on third parties and things. Resources are a big part of this as well, and this is not just resources in terms of money, but also resources in terms of expertise. So if you hire a programmer or several programmers, or if you're working with students who are doing your coding, you better have someone on your team who knows how to do software development management, like who can actually supervise students and supervise programmers, and who speaks enough of that technical language to be able to know when you're getting bullshitted, right? And what things are really hard, what things are easy, right? And to be able to actually manage the software development process. A standard project manager does not know how to do this. That's a key thing, right? I mean, it's a separate set of skills that is involved in managing programming. And when you hire a company, whether that's a sort of a completely custom shop that's going to be building custom code, or a place like Care Evolution, they have software development managers who are part of the team, right? That's part of what you get. Another thing is also where sort of when you're thinking about your project, and for the technical components of those projects, are you thinking of that as a truly interdisciplinary collaboration, where you actually want to be partnering with other faculty who have their own research questions that are related to the technical infrastructure, or do you just need someone to build your system? Like, you know exactly what you want, and it's just a matter of building a system. That leads to different kinds of setups, right? It doesn't make sense to go to a computer science faculty member and say, build me an app that does X, Y, and Z, right? That's not the kind of relationship that is going to work. You can do that with a professional programmer, or you can do that with a student that you're hiring to do the work, right? And so these questions of where the incentives are you interested in truly interdisciplinary collaborations where a project can actually push on science from different directions, or do you actually have a particular thing that you need to do, and whatever is the most efficient way of getting there is what you're choosing, and being a big part of what you want to be considering when you make decisions about the infrastructure. And finally, way, one thing that we often forget is just how quickly code ages and dies. Right? I mean, and anyone who has tried to maintain a system for any period of time knows this, that it doesn't matter how much resources you put into building a system. For that system to continue to work correctly, it needs to be maintained, right? The libraries get updated, operating systems change, and all of this stuff requires additional effort and time to actually make sure that these systems continue to work. And so even if you have a grant that funds, let's say, building of an app, unless you have resources for continued development of that, the next study you want to do with that same system is not going to work, because things will be falling apart in places that were working just fine first time around, right? And so being really thoughtful about what is the life cycle of these tools that you're building and how you want to maintain that, I think is really important. So I'll stop there and pass it to.
Okay, so thanks to my two co-speakers today. I think the spin that I'm going to take on this future-proofing your research is talking about tech company validity or volatility, and talking about engaging with the companies themselves and how do you kind of chat through that. So I think when we're working with industry from an academia standpoint, our lab in particular from the Michigan Performance Research Lab is looking at exercise physiology, how to use devices to track physical activity in different engagements within the fitness world. We have to understand that our goals in what we're trying to push forward from an academic standpoint is very different than what the industry goals are trying to achieve. And when we're trying to work together or try to establish a common agenda of a research protocol or receiving answers, thinking about from our standpoint, our field expertise, the research infrastructure that we have, and the goal to advance the scientific knowledge, but also appreciate and understand that the industry standpoint, having the funds that we're always looking for, the latest technology and the updates, and understanding what they're trying to achieve, while also getting this high quality end product. And then from our standpoint, there's lots of different ways to engage working with industry and working with these wearable tech companies, whether it's engaging in a contract, fee for service, a true clinical trial, or some form of consulting work. You have to try to figure out what the best model is based on your research design and based on what your goals are. I think from a future-proofing your research, my best advice is plan for the unpredictable or plan for the unplannable, because something's going to come up within this world and within this protocol that's not going to work out the way that you think it's going to. A quick shout out to FFMI and Mike Rennell and Shelby Unsworth team. I know part of our task here today was to kind of talk about resources that U of M has, and I can't speak highly enough about their team and being able to engage with industry sponsors and being able to engage with different companies, and helping you as faculty or researchers to set up a contract or to talk about how do I get access to data, and their team is extremely valuable. I think anticipating barriers, this is hopefully not anything new that you all are doing within your own research, but anticipating barriers within engaging with industry, thinking about feasibility, expectations, and timelines. What I would say, kind of on this next part of under promising and over delivering, being sure that you're able to achieve what it is that you're actually proposing and doing. Both of the fellow speakers here talked about personnel. There's a session later called the team. Again, I can't stress enough how important it is to have the right people around, and having the right people in the right roles to achieve what you need to achieve. Again, project manager, clinical project coordinator, the right research staff, having the skill sets that are needed to achieve what it is that you need to achieve. Budget and timeline from a research standpoint, things again are going to change. So making sure that you have contingencies in place. Volatility and change in product data. There was a really good question at the end of the last session talking about, well, how do we track things over time, or what's the volatility there? And again, hardware is going to change, software is going to change, and thinking about how you are going to adapt to those changes within the realm of your study is going to be really important. as a quick example, and I have a couple slides here as an example on the next in a little bit, but working with a company and they changed the hardware in the middle of the study. And so the metric that we were getting was going to be completely different. So from a validity standpoint, we had to wait to ship new sensors, new devices, pause enrollment, which obviously creates another headache and another burden. And then you're never going to do it right the first time. So there's lessons learned from doing it and doing it multiple times that will help you the next time, and then leaning on, again, other individuals that have gone through those processes before. So as we mentioned, we've worked with Samsung. And part of what we're working on with Samsung was validating some of their devices. We look at VO2 max in particular in this case, and looking at how their watch was predicting, or how their algorithm was allowing us to assess the validity or the agreement between gold standard VO2 max data. You can see the data that on that top right graph, and how at the top end of that graph, it kind of tails off from that reference line. And so we're able to look at these high level individuals that we were able to bring into the lab from a VO2 max standpoint. So these that are superior in their ability to use oxygen during exercise. And that's a population that these individuals weren't actually having within their algorithm development. So again, part of the great things about what we do, but also the frustrations is, you can see on the bottom right, here is the absolute error of the device when we were using it. And then once they update the algorithm, here's the device error now. So always improving and always changing. And again, if that happens in the middle of the study, being able to plan and adapt to the changes in hardware and software and in algorithm development as you go through it. So with that, I will join the rest of the group.
Okay, I will start. So this is for Pedja, because I think a lot of people are going to be pretty compelled to incorporate reinforcement learning in their research. And I imagine the coding development and analytic considerations are markedly different than what a lot of people are used to. So how do you even start building that team, and what kind of folks do you need?
Yeah, great question. So partly depends on whether your science is actually about studying innovations in reinforcement learning, or you're just trying to sort of use a vanilla reinforcement learning algorithm. And I think the two are different, right? So on if the former is the case, which is what most of my studies look like, because I work with Susan Murphy, that is her bread and butter. And so we basically have to implement our own algorithms from scratch, because she's changing the algorithms and we're trying to learn how to do them better, right? And so in those cases, you really need, if you're going to be using reinforcement learning algorithms as part of the system, you need to be either working with either build something custom that can collect the right kinds of data for the algorithm to be able to operate correctly, or need to use a system, and Care Evolution is moving in this direction, where there are enough hooks between the platform and the outside world, where you can build out the algorithm on the outside of their core platform and still feed it the data that it needs to be able to operate, and then send decisions back. And so those are the two current options, where basically either you're having to code, in which case you need both software development expertise, but also you need someone who can actually develop algorithms, because typically the way that this works is that Susan's group will do a reference version of the algorithm, and then provide that to the programmers that are actually building the app, and the programmers will then translate that into the code that goes into the application. So Susan's group does not actually build it, write the code that is actually running on our system. That gets implemented by a software developer, but they basically specify what that algorithm is, provide the initial implementation of it, and then we translate into our own code, right? But most of the time, the way that we're doing this is that the reinforcement learning algorithms are really running in the cloud, right? So they're not running directly on the phone, they're not running directly on the watch. We're feeding the data into which basically means that if you have an instantiation of a learning algorithm in the cloud, that can be connected to a custom application, or as we're currently doing, you can actually hook it into something like Care Evolution to run Care Evolution notifications through that. That's where the world is currently. What we're trying to do is we're currently building something called a Ph.D toolkit that is going to be basically a web application that you can. That the idea is that a behavioral scientist who has done a micro-randomized trial can come to this web application, plug in the data from their trial about the priors and the parameters that the reinforcement algorithm needs. And what it's going to kick out is basically a web-based version of the algorithm that can then be connected to custom code through a set of APIs. And Mark Newman is currently heading that development. We're, I would say, a third of the way there. But the idea would be to basically make use of reinforcement algorithms a little bit more accessible, where someone who has just run these studies or has consulted literature can actually just plug in the parameters into this thing and get the algorithm that is already contained in a Docker container with all of the infrastructure code that is needed to turn it on, so that you don't have to do that yourself. That's where we're heading.
My research team does a lot in the space with Fitbits. And I'm just waiting for the day where Google finally manages to kill it with their mismanagement of buying Fitbit. I'm just going to ask, what other devices should we be looking at in parallel? Come on. I'm not, this may be taboo, but I don't think I'm alone in worrying about this.
So to, I guess, make sure I'm getting the right question is, other than Fitbit, what are other devices that could be used from a research standpoint? That
this panel suggests that we start getting, because first thought was Garmin, but.
Yeah, so one thing I want to go back to is, because I really enjoyed your talk earlier of the accessibility standpoint of it. And so there's trade-offs, right? And so the Apple Watch, the Garmin Watch, they're going to be a lot more expensive, and there's data to suggest that they have higher level of accuracy in different outcomes and different measures. And I think one thing to think about too is it's really dependent on what your outcome of interest actually is, and then diving into the literature to figure out what the reliability and the accuracy of those devices are, because one device may be better for heart rate, one device may be better for VO2 fitness, one device may be better for step count, one device may be better for stride length, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think getting a good understanding of that first, and then as I think it was your question earlier as well, of accuracy and validity is important, but also reliability. And so, right, can we is the measure wrong, but I'm getting the same measure every time, right? And so, yeah, I know it's a standing on the fence answer, but it really depends on the outcome and what measure it is that you're actually looking for, and what the goal is, repeatability or validity, and then finding in the research what that best device is based on affordability as well.
I mean, there's also a question of what people are willing to wear, right? And so one of the things that we find is people who already have Apple Watches are really hesitant to take another smartwatch of any sort, right? In which case you really will need to if you're not going to be using an Apple Watch for the data, you need something that is much more in a tracker form factor than a smartwatch structure, because having another tracker on another the wrist is fine. You look like a dork if you have two watches, right? And so I think there's some sort of usability aspects here that need to be taken into account. But there's also just the access to the data is quite different across those platforms. So we started looking into Garmin for the same reasons that you did. We've been using Fitbit for a long time, partly because it works both on Android and iOS, and so it gives us sort of an easy way to cover the space. So does Garmin, which was the reason we went that way. But getting access to their development program is substantially more difficult, substantially more expensive, and depending on how you do it, substantially more buggy as well. So I have. I'm not going to name a company who's been working with them, but I have contacts with people who have been using their web APIs that are the equivalent of the Fitbit API that indicate that it's pretty unreliable. So it just sort of falls out of sync. They have two systems. They have a system that is sort of customer facing, and then they have another system that actually holds the ground truth data, and they fall out of sync. So it can be quite a bit of a mess. And so I think partly it is a compromise. So you make decisions based on what kind of resources you have, or you try to do something where you really focus on getting the data off of Apple Health and Google Fit,
Yes.
and basically anything that deposits the data into those repositories become more easily accessible. The problem, of course, is that you can't mix and match, right? I mean, so, and that is the thing, and maybe Walter will be talking about this later. But Jesse ran a study that had Apple Watches as for part of the population and Fitbit for another part of the population. And the short of it is that you end up having to look at those two data sets separately, right? And so I think that is the key thing, is that if there's any way to stick with one device across the whole sample, I think it makes things a lot easier.
Right.
Hi, I'm wondering what your experience was setting up Samsung. Especially from like an end user perspective, because my experience was very, very frustrating, unless you happen to have a Galaxy phone as well.
Yeah, so I would say that our relationship, we've done 3 projects with Samsung, and we have not done an in-life assessment with Samsung. We've done all in-lab. So part of working with Samsung is them providing the devices for us. But yes, I will say, we've worked with Apple as well, and we run into the on the other side of, if we're doing Apple Watch validity and they don't have an iPhone, we have to then provide an iPhone for those individuals. So I would say that there's definitely some benefits of having the company having financial interest in it, in providing those phones for us so that we can use it. Does that answer your question?
Build on a question I was asked earlier. A subject that hasn't come up is racial bias in the watches. There was a study in 2020 here at Michigan by Dr. Schoding and Tom Valley that showed that clinical grade SpO2 is racially biased, and that opened the floodgate. And there's been a lot of studies on wearables that have shown similar problem, because it uses light and skin pigmentation has an impact on the accuracy. So any thoughts on that? And I'm not going to ask you to tell us which ones you think are have more racial bias, but are there any specific ones that you think have been more resistant to racial bias that you can suggest?
So we haven't seen differences in what you're talking with the sleep sensor with our study, although we did find differences in the African American population with slightly lower sleep compared to other racial groups. However, we added sensor kit to our study recently, and we did find differences in the opt-in rates for sensor kit compared to some of the racial minority groups, suggesting that there are more privacy concerns and racial differences there. So I think that warrants further consideration. I know that goes a little bit afield from your wearable question. But second to that, we we have actually expanded our platform into Kenya in the last couple of years as part of the Uzima study. And so we do have Fitbits on a large population of healthcare workers there. And we are still sort of slogging through the data, but we have encountered a number of technical issues, whether related to sort of internet access, but also the possibility that you're talking about. And we have to dig into that a little bit more, but our sleep data seems to be less reliable. And so we're investigating that. So I think that is something that does require further attention.
Hello? Oh, it is. Okay. So something that's interesting that people assume typically that all the sleep algorithms are going to use photoplasmography for the cardiac autonomic activity as an input into the algorithm. Apple uses all motion. So Apple Sleep is entirely motion. Apple's OSA algorithm, if you're to determine if you have a high risk for moderate to severe OSA, is all motion. So it's possible that with the Apple Watch, you were actually getting better data from people with dark skin. But I do think that the manufacturers, just based on working with these companies and validating their data in our sleep lab, they really are using the Fitzpatrick score, and they're really trying to recruit many different skin colors so what Sardar is talking about is that green light photoplasmography performing worse in people of color. And they're really working on mitigating this. So I think that the error is just going to continue to go down and down. And again, it's about what you're measuring. Like if you're going to do an oximetry study, I personally don't think you should be using a reflectance device anyway, because you're getting inaccurate data regardless of skin color. So that's, again, is picking the right tool for your measurement and your population.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's right. In some of the things that we've done in our most recent study as well is von Luschen scale, Fitzpatrick scale, and making sure that you're getting a wide range of skin tones to understand how whatever outcome it is being affected. And again, if Apple's using motion and Samsung might not be, or Garmin might not be, right, understanding how that changes and how the validity changes across different skin tones and affects different populations is extremely important.
I have one more question. I'm going to put Adam on the spot. I'm sorry. But the reason that we got to meet Adam is because he had an issue with data extraction and analysis when operating in a certain manufacturer's environment. So if you could, with what you're willing to share, kind of the problem that you had and how you guys addressed that.
Yeah, so another shout out to the resources here with Emden and Gabriel in Victoria and the team. We working with different companies, and you either have access to the raw data yourself, or you might have to go into a secure platform to access that data that's built in some other environment. And so when we were searching for an individual to help, and the example that I'll give is working with Apple and SensorKit and HealthKit data being specifically stored on a Python-based cloud service. And having secure logins and going into a virtual environment and being able to access and operate with that data well beyond my skill set in the team that we had at the time. And Yong, our new data manager, is here, which is great. And so we were able to kind of do a search to be able to find the right person in the right skill set. Because again, thinking about my background, exercise physiology, sports medicine, athletic training, definitely not on the computer science side, but being able to utilize the resources and tailor the posting the correct way, again, to find the right members of the team that can come in and do the tasks that we need. So we can ask the questions, we can answer the questions, but we need that help for somebody to come in and actually grab that data for us and analyze it in the right way. So there's definitely resources here at U of M that will help you do that. And then for us, had, again, a mini success story here as we move forward and analyze that data from Apple.